Every year, thousands of buyers in the UK sign contracts to purchase residential properties that do not yet exist. They hand over a deposit on a flat or house that is still a hole in the ground, a CGI render and a brochure full of aspirational lifestyle photography. They lock in a price based on a market that existed at the time of reservation, and they agree to complete on that price at a date that could be anywhere from 6 months to 3 years in the future. This is off-plan buying, and it has been a standard feature of the UK new build market for decades, normalized through Help to Buy schemes, developer marketing, and the genuine appeal of reserving what appears to be a desirable property at today's price before it is completed. I have been tracking the UK property market for years, and off-plan buying has always carried risks that are materially different from buying a completed property, but those risks have become considerably more acute in the current market, and the specific combination of conditions in 2026 has made the off-plan sector one of the highest risk areas of the residential property market for buyers who have not done thorough due diligence. In the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through the specific risks that are currently most elevated in the off-plan market, what has changed to make them more acute than in previous cycles, and what buyers who are considering or have already committed to an off-plan purchase actually need to know. Some of these risks have always been present in off-plan buying. Others have become significantly more acute because of specific conditions in the current market, and a meaningful number of buyers currently approaching completion on off-plan reservations made in 2022, 2023, and 2024 are about to encounter several of them simultaneously. Let's start with the basic mechanism of off-plan buying and why it creates a fundamentally different risk profile from buying a completed property. When you buy off-plan, you are entering a legally binding contract to purchase a property at a specified price on a specified completion date based on a specification that may or may not accurately reflect what you eventually receive. You pay a deposit, typically between 5 and 10% of the purchase price, at exchange of contracts, which occurs before the property is built. That deposit is at risk if you cannot or choose not to complete when the time comes. The developer builds the property, and when it is ready, you are required to complete the purchase at the price you agreed, regardless of what has happened to the market, to your own financial circumstances, or to your ability to obtain mortgage finance at the level you anticipated when you originally reserved. Red flag number 1, the valuation gap that has emerged as a defining feature of the current off-plan market. When a lender approves a mortgage for an off-plan property, they typically carry out their formal valuation at the point the property is completed and ready for occupation, not at the point of reservation. If the market has moved between reservation and completion, the completed valuation may differ significantly from the original purchase price. In a falling or stagnant market for new builds, which is precisely the market that currently exists for a significant portion of the UK flat sector, as I have covered in multiple previous videos on this channel, the completed valuation coming in below the reservation price is not an edge case. It is a genuine, documented, recurring outcome. When the valuation comes in below the purchase price, the lender will only lend against the lower valuation, meaning the buyer must fund the gap from their own resources. A buyer who reserved a flat at £300,000 and finds the completion valuation comes in at £270,000 faces a £30,000 shortfall that nobody warned them to budget for at the point of reservation. The options at that point are limited, and none of them is comfortable. Fund the shortfall from savings, renegotiate the purchase price with the developer, or withdraw from the purchase and accept the loss of the deposit. In a market where the developer is under their own financial pressure and has other buyers waiting, the negotiating leverage of a buyer seeking a price reduction at the completion stage is considerably weaker than it would be in a normal resale transaction. Red flag number 2, the mortgage offer expiry problem that becomes acute when completions are delayed. A mortgage offer from a lender is typically valid for 6 months, sometimes up to 12 months for new build properties, with some lenders making allowances for construction timelines. When an off-plan development takes longer to complete than the original timeline suggested, which is a consistent pattern in the current market given the construction cost and contractor availability pressures I have described in previous videos on this channel, a buyer may find that their mortgage offer has expired by the time the developer is actually ready to complete. The buyer must then reapply for a mortgage at whatever the market rate is at the point of reapplication and under whatever lending criteria are then in force. If rates have risen, if the buyer's financial circumstances have changed, or if lender criteria have tightened in the intervening period, the new mortgage may cost more, cover less, or in the worst case not be available at all, leaving the buyer in the position of having committed to a purchase they can no longer finance. Red flag number 3, the specification drift that means the property completed is not always the property sold.
The specification provided at the point of off-plan reservation, the brochure, the show home, the sample finishes and fittings, represents what the developer intends to build. What is actually built can differ from that intention in ways ranging from trivial to significant. Changes in material availability, cost pressure on the developer, substitution of fixtures and fittings with lower specification alternatives, changes to the layout or dimensions of specific rooms, and alterations to the communal facilities or external appearance of the building are all possible during the construction period, and the contractual protections that buyers have against these changes are in most standard off-plan contracts considerably weaker than buyers assume. The legal threshold for what constitutes a material change that would allow a buyer to pull out of the contract is typically high, meaning a developer can make a meaningful number of changes to what they deliver without the buyer having a clear contractual right to withdraw. Buyers who arrive at a snagging inspection expecting the property they saw in the show home and find a noticeably lower specification version have limited legal recourse in most standard off-plan contracts because the specification was presented as indicative rather than contractually binding, a point that is buried in the small print of reservation agreements that most buyers sign without reading in full. Red flag number 4, the developer insolvency risk that has become significantly more acute in the current market. As I've covered in previous videos on this channel, the UK house building industry is under considerable financial pressure, with a number of smaller and mid-sized developers having entered administration in recent years, and with the balance sheets of larger developers carrying write-downs and impairments that reflect a genuinely difficult trading environment. When a developer enters administration during the construction phase of a development, the outcome for buyers who have paid a deposit off-plan is determined by whether the developer has complied with their legal obligation to protect that deposit, either through a deposit protection scheme or through a solicitor's client account arrangement. In practice, the protection arrangements are not always as robust as they should be, and buyers in administrations have in some cases waited months or years for a resolution of their position, during which they cannot complete elsewhere because their funds are tied up in the failed development.
Red flag number 5 is the service charge and ground rent reveal that occurs at completion and that buyers have no power to renegotiate. The service charge estimate provided at the point of off-plan reservation is exactly that, an estimate. When the building is completed and the actual costs of running the communal facilities, the building insurance, the management and the ground rent are established, the actual annual costs frequently exceed the estimates provided at reservation. As I've covered extensively in previous videos on this channel, service charge inflation in the UK leasehold sector has been significant and persistent, and the service charge estimates in off-plan sales brochures are, with some regularity, set at a level that makes the total occupancy cost look more attractive than the eventual reality. A buyer who factored a specific service charge figure into their affordability calculation at the point of reservation may discover at completion that the actual service charge is 30 or 50% higher, materially affecting the ongoing cost of ownership they committed to. Now here is what connects all of these red flags together. Off-plan buying works well as a model when 3 conditions are met. The market is rising or stable, the developer is financially robust, and the buyer's own financial position is secure and unchanged between reservation and completion. When any of those 3 conditions is uncertain, which in the current UK new build market all 3 simultaneously are, the risks that are inherent in the off-plan model become genuinely acute rather than theoretical. The buyer who reserved in 2023 or 2024 in a market that was already showing stress and whose completion is approaching in 2025 or 2026 is in a market environment where all 3 of those conditions are under question simultaneously, and the combination of a potential valuation shortfall, a potentially expired mortgage offer, and a potentially financially stretched developer creates a risk profile that the original reservation process was entirely unequipped to communicate accurately. The sales process for off-plan properties is optimized to create confidence and excitement at the reservation stage at exactly the moment when all of the risks described in this video are furthest from completion and therefore easiest to minimize or ignore. The moment when those risks become fully visible is at completion, when they are hardest to manage.
I spoke with a property lawyer who handles a significant number of off-plan completions and disputes, and off the record their assessment was direct. They said the volume of off-plan completion disputes they are managing has increased meaningfully over the last 18 months, and the pattern they see consistently is buyers who made reservations in good faith on the basis of advice and information that was accurate at the time, but that has been overtaken by market events that nobody predicted with confidence at the time of reservation. They said the buyers who are best placed to navigate problems are those who kept kept their mortgage offer renewed, who built a contingency into their finances for a valuation shortfall, and who had their solicitor review the contract carefully at exchange for the developer's rights to vary the specification. They said the buyers who were worst placed are those who did none of those things, who assumed the process would be straightforward because the sales agent told them it would be, and who are now discovering at the completion stage that several things have changed from what they were expecting. They described one case that illustrates the problem clearly: a buyer who reserved in a development at a price that reflected the market at the time, whose mortgage offer expired during a construction delay, who reapplied for a mortgage only to discover that the completed valuation came in below the reservation price, and who simultaneously discovered that the developer had substituted lower specification kitchen fittings during construction. 3 separate problems arriving simultaneously at the completion stage, each of which would have been navigable individually had it been anticipated, but which together created a genuinely acute financial and legal position that took months to resolve. So what does this mean practically? First, if you are considering an off-plan reservation, build a specific contingency into your financial planning for the possibility that the completion valuation comes in below the reservation price, specifically modeling the scenario where the gap is 10% of the purchase price, and asking yourself whether you can fund that gap from your own resources without having to withdraw from the purchase. Second, ask your mortgage broker specifically about the lender's policy on mortgage offer renewals for off-plan properties, and factor the timeline risk into your choice of lender, since some lenders are more accommodating than others on extension timelines for new build completions. Third, have your solicitor specifically review the specification change clauses in the contract before you exchange, specifically asking what changes the developer is permitted to make without your consent, and whether any specific elements of the specification that are important to you can be made contractually binding. Fourth, research the developer's financial position before you commit, including checking Companies House for recent accounts, looking for any press coverage of the developer's financial situation, and asking your solicitor whether there are any known financial concerns about the specific development. Fifth, make sure your deposit is protected through an appropriate scheme, and specifically ask your solicitor to confirm the protection arrangement before you exchange, because deposit protection is a legal requirement, but compliance is not uniform.
Here is how I expect this to develop. The off-plan market is likely to remain under pressure for as long as the new build valuation problems, the developer financial pressures, and the mortgage rate environment that affects completion affordability continue in their current form, which based on current trajectories is likely to be for at least another year or two. Expect the volume of off-plan completion difficulties to remain elevated, particularly for developments that were reserved at the peak of the market and that are now approaching completion in a market where valuations are lower than reservation prices. Expect developers to continue offering enhanced incentives at completion, including cashback, stamp duty paid, and rate reducer schemes as a way of bridging the gap between reservation prices and the actual values that buyers and lenders are willing to transact at, and expect those incentives to themselves be a signal to any sophisticated buyer about how far the market has moved since the original reservation. A developer offering £25,000 cashback at completion is in effect acknowledging that the reservation price was set above what the market can currently sustain, and a buyer receiving that incentive should understand it as a discounted actual price rather than as a bonus on top of a fair market price. The uncomfortable truth is that off-plan buying transfers a meaningful amount of market risk from the developer to the buyer, and that risk transfer is almost never clearly communicated in the marketing materials and sales conversations that precede an off-plan reservation. The developer knows when completion is likely, has a view on what the market will look like at completion, and has structured the contract to protect their position in scenarios where the market moves against the buyer. The buyer who has not taken specific, specialist advice about exactly what they are committing to is at a structural information disadvantage that the glossy brochure and the enthusiastic sales agent are not designed to correct. The 5 risks covered in this video are all knowable in advance, and all manageable if you know to look for them. None of them are knowable or manageable if you sign the reservation agreement on the basis of the developer's sales presentation alone, without independent legal, financial, and market advice that is specifically focused on identifying and quantifying each of them for your specific purchase.